For decades, the Vietcong was presented as a symbol of popular struggle, but under that image was hidden a system of total control, based on fear, forced obedience, and the calculated destruction of all dissent. It was not just a war, it was a model of integral domination. Without visible structures, without fixed uniforms, and without recognizable rules, it managed to impose its order in entire villages, molding daily life through terror, manipulation, and silence. Everything that did not serve the revolutionary project was eliminated without contemplations. How did that system really work? What happened in the zones controlled by the Viet Cong? And why does its history remain hidden half a century after the communist victory? From Viet Minh to Viet Cong, genesis of a guerrilla. Vietnam had known foreign occupation for millennia. 1,000 years under Chinese administration forged a culture of resistance that would become the foundation of one of the most lethal insurgencies of the 20th century. When France incorporated the territory into its colonial empire in 1858, it unleashed forces that would eventually destroy not only its presence, but the stability of the entire region. French colonization transformed Vietnam into a gigantic plantation where peasants became serfs in their own lands. Confiscatory taxes, forced labor, and education reserved exclusively for collaborators created a resentment that would fuel decades of subsequent violence. During World War II, the Japanese occupation of 1940 established Franco-Japanese collaboration that maximized the exploitation of Vietnamese resources. The catastrophic famine of 1945 eliminated more than 1 million people, exposing the moral collapse of the occupiers and creating a legitimacy vacuum that would be filled by revolutionary forces. In this context emerged Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary whose training in France, the Soviet Union, and China provided him with a lethal synthesis of Vietnamese nationalism and Marxist-Leninist organizational discipline. In 1941, he established the Viet Minh, merging for the first time traditional patriotic fervor with modern communist operational structure. The Viet Minh expanded during the Japanese occupation, establishing guerrilla networks that presented the movement as the only authentically Vietnamese force. After Japanese capitulation, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed independence, citing the American Declaration, but France sent troops to restore its colonial empire. The First Indochina War lasted 8 years, during which the Viet Minh perfected psychological attrition tactics that included coordinated ambushes, infrastructure sabotage, and peasant mobilization that converted entire populations into intelligence networks. Superior knowledge of the terrain, combined with Chinese support after Mao's victory in 1949, compensated for their inferiority in conventional weaponry. Jen bien phu in mot chin nam mot tram nam moi, tu jan dao ket tuch qua je quoc fap. For 56 days, Vietnamese forces besieged 13,000 French soldiers in a mountainous valley, bombing their positions while cutting supplies. The French surrender was total, forcing Paris to negotiate its definitive withdrawal. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the north under Ho Chi Minh, the south under a government backed by the United States. The reunification elections agreed for 1956 never occurred. Ngo Dinh Diem, Catholic president of the South, cancelled them, fearing a communist victory, a decision that radicalized the situation and sowed the seeds of an infinitely more destructive civil war. Diem's regime intensified repression against communists, Buddhists, and peasants, implementing strategic hamlets that resembled concentration camps. His discriminatory policies favored Catholic urban elites while ignoring the rural Buddhist majority, creating resentments that would fuel the subsequent insurgency. In 1960, the opposition reorganized as the National Liberation Front, contemptuously called Viet Cong by its enemies. Although it presented itself as a southern movement, it was profoundly directed from Hanoi, where the Communist Party coordinated strategic operations while providing training, weapons, and political directives. The Viet Cong adopted the Maoist doctrine of prolonged popular war, clandestine political organization, guerrilla warfare, and finally, conventional warfare. To sustain this strategy, North Vietnam built the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a logistical network that transported weapons, supplies and combatants from the northern mountains to the southern jungles, crossing Laos and Cambodia. Constantly bombed by American aviation, the route was reconstructed through the work of tens of thousands of mobilized engineers and peasants. Its regeneration capacity became a symbol of Vietnamese determination and a logistical nightmare for strategists who never managed to interrupt the flow of supplies. The Vietcong developed an organizational structure that combined local political cells, guerrilla units, civil intelligence networks, and parallel administrations that competed with the Saigon government. Its strength resided in the infiltration of villages where it established popular tribunals, land redistribution and services that the official state did not provide. This dual infrastructure created perfect conditions for extreme methods of social control that would transcend any concept of conventional warfare. Eliminated without a trace, the engineering of selective murder. Starting in 1957, the Vietcong implemented the campaign of destruction of the enemy administrative apparatus, a doctrine that converted political assassination into a tool of social engineering. This operation transcended military violence to transform into a program of physical elimination destined to conquer absolute control of rural communities. Intelligence services compiled exhaustive inventories of counter-revolutionary elements in each village of the South. The blacklists contained detailed information about village chiefs, teachers, doctors, police, religious leaders, and any figure who symbolized state presence in peasant life. Each person represented a link in the chain of authority that connected Saigon with base communities. The executions were organized as ritual theater. Victims were extracted during nocturnal operations and executed publicly through methods calculated to create lasting trauma: shots to the head, decapitations with machetes, hangings, and live burials. In the Mekong Delta, corpses were dragged through the streets and hung with signs. This happens to the dogs of the Saigon regime. The bodies remained exposed for days as anatomical lessons of terror. Some were decorated with slogans written in blood: "Traitor to the Revolution," "Agent of Yankee Imperialism." Children were forced to observe the executions and march in front of the corpses in indoctrination exercises through horror. Village chiefs constituted priority objectives. Their assassination, accompanied by the elimination of complete families, provoked the immediate collapse of local state authority. In hours, Vietcong popular committees occupied the vacuum, establishing revolutionary tribunals and surveillance networks that monitored every aspect of village life. Teachers faced special persecution for transmitting bourgeois values. In Quang Ngai, an educator was forced to dig his own grave in front of the school before being executed for teaching the Latin alphabet. They were frequently murdered in front of their students as lessons about the consequences of spreading imperialist ideological poison. Religious leaders represented ideological threats to dialectical materialism. Buddhist monks were ceremonially decapitated while pagodas were burned. Catholic priests and Protestant ministers suffered prolonged tortures before their executions, accused of serving as agents of Western spiritual corruption. Between 1957 and 1972, conservative estimates documented the execution of 36,000 to 50,000 civilians for exclusively political reasons, although the real figure probably exceeded 100,000 victims. In Binh Dinh province, more than 300 murders against local figures were recorded between 1967 and 1970. In Go Vap, near Saigon, a pit was discovered with 9 teachers executed with shots to the neck, selected for participating in American literacy programs. A deserter identified as Tan confessed to having participated in 40 public executions between 1964 and 1968. Each shot was an educational lesson, he explained, citing the doctrine that justified these acts as necessary political pedagogy. This campaign irreversibly altered the rural social structure. Entire communities were left deprived of leaders, educators, and spiritual figures. Fear was institutionalized as a control mechanism more effective than any military presence. The psychological consequences persist to the present day. Exterminated families, broken traditions, eroded interpersonal trust. The political terror of the Vietcong was not an accidental byproduct, but a deliberate tool to conquer total control of Vietnamese society, anticipating forms of political genocide that would eliminate not only individuals, but complete social classes. Jungles of Pain, the invisible prisons of the Vietcong. In the depths of the jungles of Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, the Vietcong established a clandestine prison network that operated as a laboratory of human suffering. These mobile installations, constructed with bamboo and camouflaged under the vegetation canopy, became centers of physical and psychological breaking, where prisoners faced techniques refined during decades of revolutionary conflict. The complexes were relocated every 2 weeks to avoid bombing, forcing chained prisoners to marches of up to 20 kilometers under armed surveillance. These walks were conducted without prolonged pauses under tropical heat, constant rain, or mountainous terrain. Those who collapsed were abandoned or dragged by other prisoners. Foot wounds, leech infections, and extreme dehydration accompanied the constant displacement, making it difficult to establish any routine or organized resistance. The captives were housed in pits, excavated directly in the earth, in cages suspended between trees, or in cabins without walls that exposed them completely to the elements. There was no distinction between day and night. Direct exposure to sun, rain, insects, and monsoon winds formed a deliberate part of the prison environment. All permanent construction was avoided, which prevented the development of minimum conditions of hygiene or rest. The muddy ground, improvised leaf roofs, and continuous humidity were part of the breaking design. Malnutrition was not a consequence of the chaos of war, but a deliberate policy. The diet consisted of moldy rice, raw roots, boiled leaves, collected insects, and occasionally remains of fermented fish. For days, no food was supplied, while water access was rationed to minimum levels. The jailers, by contrast, received stable rations, which allowed measuring the prisoners' physical deterioration as a controlled variable. The consequences were predictable: dysentery, typhoid fever, beriberi, scurvy, necrotizing infections, and malaria without any treatment. In many installations, medical casualties were not recorded because the dead were buried without documentation or ceremony. Psychological isolation was a fundamental component of the system. Prisoners were separated from each other, deprived of all exterior information, and maintained in obligatory silence. Human contact was restricted exclusively to interrogations. Uncertainty about one's own fate and that of other prisoners generated episodes of extreme anguish, prolonged insomnia, loss of temporal notion, auditory and visual hallucinations, and in many cases, catatonic states. The absence of any predictable stimulus, schedules, sounds, interactions, produced a progressive collapse of individual perception. Physical breaking techniques were multiple and adapted to specific objectives. Tiger cages, bamboo structures of 1 meter by 1 meter, prevented lying down or standing up. They were placed under the equatorial sun or exposed to incessant rains, provoking muscular inflammation, purulent ulcers, loss of body mass, dermal infections, and severe disorientation. Some prisoners remained weeks in these conditions. Beatings were applied with instruments designed to inflict pain without causing immediate death: flexible bamboo rods, wood sticks hardened by heat, AK-47 rifle butts. The blows were systematically directed at ribs, kneecaps, spinal column, peripheral nerves, and soft organs. In documented cases, interrogators alternated punishment sessions with brief rest periods to prolong pain without provoking total loss of consciousness. Other techniques included suspension by extremities, a practice that hung the prisoner from wrists or ankles for 6, 12, or more hours. This position provoked multiple dislocations, vascular pressure, intense neurological pain, and temporary paralysis of extremities. Victims frequently required assistance to walk for subsequent days, being forced to do so under threat of new sessions. Simulated asphyxiation through pouring water through mouth and nose while the head was covered with wet cloth induced sensation of imminent drowning, activating survival reflexes under conditions of absolute containment. It was applied in multiple rounds until the prisoner lost control of sphincters or entered convulsion. Another widely documented practice was confinement in wooden boxes of 60 cubic centimeters called living coffins. Captives were introduced in fetal position without possibility of movement, remaining thus between 24 and 72 hours. These sessions induced claustrophobia, sensory deprivation, extreme cramps, and in several cases, complete psychological collapse. The jailers alternated episodes of torture with carefully planned emotional manipulation. During some days, they provided additional food, allowed brief baths, or simulated gestures of kindness. In these phases, they promised liberation, offered contact with family members, or accepted letters to the exterior that were later destroyed. The purpose was to create a relationship of emotional dependence that would further weaken the prisoner's internal resistance. The alternation between sadism and calculated compassion formed part of the general design of the system. Prisoners considered of military or propagandistic interest were subjected to constant interrogations with pressure to sign false declarations. In many cases, they were forced to write self-incriminating confessions in which they declared war crimes, political treason, or collaboration with imperialists. Some were filmed or recorded reading these confessions, which were later transmitted by Radio Hanoi or shown to international delegations as proof of repentance. Most of these declarations were written by the interrogators and read under direct threat. Vietnamese captives from the south, classified as traitors to the homeland or revisionist bourgeois, received the most severe treatment. They were considered ideological apostates and were denied any possibility of redemption. Their interrogations were more violent, their detention conditions more degrading, and their deaths were not reported. In several testimonies, it is noted that some of their bodies were used for trial of new techniques, such as prolongation of enclosure in coffins, application of natural poisons in open wounds, or continuous exposure to carrion insects without protection. The most documented case in Western sources was that of American officer James Nicholas Rowe, captured in 1963 and kept in captivity for 5 years. He was chained, confined in bamboo cages, deprived of human contact for months, and subjected to daily interrogations. The constant pressure for him to sign political declarations against the United States did not manage to break him. He escaped in 1968 after killing a guard with a machete and managed to reach an Allied zone where he was rescued by helicopter. His book, 5 Years to Freedom, became one of the most detailed testimonies about the Vietcong's clandestine prison system. Other prisoners, less known, were forced to participate in false recordings to simulate good treatment or confess invented crimes. Occasionally, prisoners were presented to international delegations or foreign journalists, but only after being fed, cleaned, and instructed for several days. These visits were carefully staged as part of a counter-information campaign. The Vietcong's clandestine prison system operated as a parallel war where combat was not fought with weapons, but with hunger, isolation, manipulation, and mental destruction administered with meticulousness. The techniques used were recorded in internal manuals, translated into various languages, and shared with revolutionary allies from other regions. These were not improvised installations, but mobile structures organized according to operational protocols that prioritized mobility, invisibility, total control, and progressive exploitation of the captive. Decisions about maintaining, transferring, executing, or liberating a prisoner were made by political committees based on their strategic or symbolic value. The treatment of each prisoner responded to a logic of utility, as a source of information, propaganda material, exemplary punishment, or experimental practice. Ideological purge in the imperial city. The Hue massacre during the Tet Offensive transformed the most beautiful city in Vietnam into the scene of an ideological cleansing operation that eliminated between 2,800 and 6,000 civilians in just 26 days. This purge was not an emotional excess of exalted combatants nor collateral damage from urban warfare. It was revolutionary social engineering executed with bureaucratic precision, planned with months or even years of anticipation by the communist apparatus. On January 30th, 1968, more than 80,000 communist combatants simultaneously attacked more than 100 South Vietnamese cities during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The Tet Offensive sought to provoke a generalized popular uprising and demonstrate that no corner of South Vietnam was safe, not even under American protection. Hue, former imperial capital, university city and spiritual center of the country, represented an objective of maximum symbolic value whose conquest would have national and international resonance. In the early morning of January 31st, combined forces of the Vietcong and North Vietnamese regular troops penetrated the defenses after a coordinated assault that had required months of logistical preparation. They took control of the imperial citadel, numerous administrative buildings, and a large part of the urban center. But the military operation was not the end, it was the beginning. The objective was not only to take Hue, but to transform it into a model of a liberated city under revolutionary control, demonstrating the viability of the communist project not only in military terms, but also administrative and social. This transformation required the physical elimination of all social classes that could resist the construction of the new order. The presence of officials, intellectuals, religious leaders, teachers, businessmen, and local military was seen as a structural threat to the advance of communism. Therefore, the invaders did not act in an improvised manner. They operated with blacklists compiled during years by clandestine Vietcong cells, which had discreetly infiltrated Hue's neighborhoods long before 1968. These listings contained complete names, addresses, positions held, religious affiliations, and family links of all those considered enemies of the people. Once military control of key zones was secured, specialized commandos began systematic raids, house by house, guided by the precompiled inventories. These were not indiscriminate arrests, but methodical elimination. Soldiers arrived with documents, read specific names, and took people away without allowing farewells. In neighborhoods inhabited by officials and professionals, more than 80% of adult residents disappeared during the first 72 hours. The execution methods varied according to the symbolic status of the victims. For public figures, shots to the neck with Tokarev pistols or AK-47 rifles were common. The bodies appeared tied with rusted wire with precise wounds and signs of planned execution. Victims considered ideologically dangerous, religious leaders, intellectuals, political opponents, were transported outside the urban center and executed in mass graves dug on the banks of the Perfume River, agricultural fields, or abandoned cemeteries. Some were buried alive after being forced to excavate their own graves, a practice used deliberately to provoke ritualized terror and political humiliation before death. In Phu Cam, Dam Chun, Bai Dao, and Tu Dam Pagoda, improvised processing centers were established where mass executions were carried out 24 hours a day. Victims were grouped in batches of 20 to 50 people and murdered at regular intervals. Police officers, ex-military and local politicians were subjected to prolonged tortures before being executed. Fractured ribs, skulls crushed with hammers, nails torn out, fingers amputated, burns with cigarettes or acid. Everything formed part of a mechanism whose objective was not simply to kill, but to break the city as a structure of symbolic power and replace it with a new revolutionary architecture. The magnitude of the purge was revealed after the recovery of Hue by South Vietnamese and American forces on February 24th. In the following weeks, patrols and rescue teams began to find mass graves in forests, school gardens, riverbanks, and temple courtyards. Tu Dam Pagoda contained more than 150 bodies of monks, women, and children. In Dam Chan and the Perfume River, more than 300 corpses tied in family groups were exhumed. Gia Hoi School, used as an interrogation and execution center, had bodies buried directly in its courtyard. The density of corpses was so extreme that heavy machinery was required to remove the compacted earth. Tropical heat and humidity accelerated decomposition, making facial recognition impossible. Identification had to be done by clothes, personal effects, dental records, or religious tattoos. The excavations revealed patterns of systematic execution, aligned victims, repeated body positions, wounds in the same anatomical zones, identical ropes, and arrangements that evidenced standardized logistical procedures. For the executors, the victims were not innocent civilians, but class enemies. They were traitors to the people, feudal residues, or agents of the imperialist bourgeoisie. Internal documents captured during the communist retreat justified the massacre as elimination of the feudal bourgeois oppressive apparatus, a necessary step to implant a model of scientific socialism. From that logic, these were not crimes, but political purification. However, the extreme brutality, the absence of legal procedures, and the murder of women, children, and religious leaders openly contradicted any justification according to international norms of conflict. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Entire families were exterminated. Traditional communities lost their teachers, doctors, and spiritual guides. The cultural and educational elite of the city was decimated. Distrust, fear, and silence became norms of conduct. For years, the inhabitants of Hue avoided talking about the event, even among themselves. Many assumed behaviors of social invisibility, avoiding politics, not standing out, not expressing opinions. The collective trauma of February 1968 redefined the relationship of citizens with power, ideology, and memory. At the international level, the massacre profoundly altered the perception of the conflict. Although militarily the Tet was contained by the United States, its psychological impact was catastrophic. Images of street fighting, piled corpses, and testimonies of mass graves eroded American public support for the war. Television reports, press articles, and photographs of Hue circulated around the world. Intelligence agencies and diplomatic delegations presented evidence before the UN. For Saigon and Washington, Hue became a symbol of communist brutality. For millions of viewers, it marked the beginning of disenchantment with the viability of intervention in Vietnam. The Vietnamese Communist Party, however, never acknowledged the massacre. After the reunification of 1975, the official narrative systematically denied the facts or presented them as propagandistic invention of the enemy. Archives were classified, victim lists censored. No official monuments exist. Surviving families were silenced through surveillance, threats, and marginalization. Public education omitted any mention of the episode, and academic investigations were prohibited for being considered counter-revolutionary activities. Hue was not an excess of war, nor a deviation from the norm. It was a premeditated, rational, and carefully executed operation, an ideological purge whose objective was to eliminate in less than a month an entire generation of leaders, replace traditional structures with communist organizations, and demonstrate that revolutionary socialism did not require the consent of the governed, but their total submission. For 26 days, the imperial city was converted into a laboratory of social re-engineering through murder. Stolen childhood, the forced militarization of minors. For thousands of Vietnamese children, the war was not observed from a distance, but a reality that tore them from their homes and transformed them into disposable instruments of revolutionary war. The Vietcong used minors as combatants, spies, saboteurs, suicide terrorists, and executioners, implementing these practices with institutional planning and without consideration for conventions on child protection. Nocturnal kidnappings became a recurring nightmare in peasant communities of the South. Specialized commandos executed incursions directed against children between 10 and 15 years old, selected after previous studies on physical strength, family loyalties, and socioeconomic vulnerability. These operations were not random. They required detailed intelligence about family composition, domestic routines, paternal absences, and distance from Army of the Republic of Vietnam patrols. Some commandos operated with lists elaborated from local informants or communal records obtained through infiltration. The commandos arrived in absolute silence. They surrounded selected dwellings and extracted children with military efficiency. Parents who tried to resist were beaten or executed in front of their families as public punishment. Mothers were forced to personally hand over their children under threat of burning the entire village. In several documented cases, the kidnappers left written warnings or symbols on walls to discourage reprisals or denunciations. Many children woke up chained in the jungle without understanding how or why they had been taken. According to CIA documents declassified in 1969, in some provinces of the Mekong Delta, up to 15% of Vietcong combatants were under 16 years old. In units specialized in sabotage or reconnaissance, the percentage rose to 30% due to the tactical advantages of using children: low stature, ease of movement, social invisibility, and psychological malleability. Internal intelligence reports identified similar patterns in mountainous regions of Thai Nguyen, where minors were used as guides, carriers, and sentries. The captured minors were transported to distant camps, established in areas of difficult access between dense jungles or mountain ranges. At these sites began a systematic process of psychological transformation designed to eliminate all previous identity. The first phase was isolation. They were prohibited from using their real names, mentioning their families, or talking about their previous life. Any attempt to remember the past was repressed with beatings, food deprivation, or confinement in covered pits. Depersonalization was the first objective of the instructors. Ideological indoctrination began immediately. Between 6 and 12 hours daily were dedicated to political education based on adapted Marxist texts, selected readings on Vietnamese revolutionary history, and collective memorization sessions of slogans. Children were inculcated that their parents were traitors if they collaborated with the enemy, that their villages were centers of bourgeois corruption, and that the National Liberation Front was their only legitimate family. The idea was reinforced that dying for the revolution was the most honorable destiny. Military training was simultaneous and brutal. Miners ran barefoot through paths plagued with traps, carrying AK-47 replicas until they mastered their weight. They crawled between barbed wire, crossed real minefields during nocturnal exercises, and practiced silent assassination with bamboo knives. They learned to assemble artisanal explosives, fabricate mines with cans and cables, shoot with accuracy at short and medium distance, and execute ambushes with coded signaling. Nguyen Van Hong, an ex-child soldier who survived, related, "The first day they beat me for asking about my mother. The second day they told me my father was a traitor. The third, I no longer had tears to cry nor memories to remember." His testimony is one among dozens collected by researchers years after the conflict. Children were classified according to age, complexion, and mental capacities. The smallest were destined for messaging tasks. They crossed enemy lines carrying coded information memorized, without carrying documents or weapons. Others pretended to beg in villages controlled by the government, observing patrol patterns, defensive structures, and logistical changes. Their childish appearance served as natural camouflage in a hyper-vigilant environment. In combat, miners were used as saboteurs. They were assigned the placement of explosive charges on bridges, strategic paths, and ammunition depots. Some specialized as snipers, shooting from treetops where their low weight allowed them to reach heights unreachable for adults. Training included techniques to blend with the environment, alter breathing rhythms, and act as immobile elements for hours. One of the most extreme functions was their use as suicide terrorists. In documented operations, children were sent to enemy military posts with explosives hidden in baskets, clothes, or pack animals. In Quang Ngai, in 1969, an 11-year-old girl approached a detachment with a fruit basket. The C4 explosive hidden was detonated by remote control, killing 5 soldiers and the girl. Witnesses reported that she had been kidnapped 3 weeks before and indoctrinated to believe that her sacrifice would save South Vietnam. The indoctrination culminated when miners were forced to execute prisoners to demonstrate loyalty. Refusal implied immediate punishment, beatings, confinement, or witnessing the execution of another child. Once they killed, they were trapped in a closed circle. They could not return to their homes because they were murderers. They could not desert because they knew too much, and they could not surrender because they would be considered enemy combatants. This structural logic converted children into functional pieces without exit. Internal statistics estimated that approximately 60% died in combat during the first 2 years. Another 25% was executed by officers for attempted escape, insubordination, or low performance. Only 15% survived until the end of the conflict. Many of the survivors suffered serious physical sequelae, poorly healed wounds, loss of extremities, chronic infections. Regarding their psychological state, subsequent reports documented recurring cases of anxiety, violent episodes, severe insomnia, and dissociative behavior. Hung, one of the few who returned to his village, told, "I was 13 when they forced me to shoot a kneeling man who was crying. I didn't sleep normally for months. When I returned, my mother didn't recognize me. The child she knew had disappeared." The war produced tens of thousands of orphans who were recruited as the last option for survival. Without parents, without food, and without shelter, these miners were considered ideal material for recruitment campaigns. The commandos presented themselves as saviors. They offered food, belonging, and a purpose. In reality, they converted them into rotating combatants. For years, these children lived under constant displacements, assuming new identities each season without schooling or stable contact with any adult outside the military structure. Specific manuals for the use of miners in armed struggle were documented. In a text captured in 1970 titled "Recruitment of Juvenile Combatants," it was established, juvenile elements possess operational advantages due to their infiltration capacity, their superior obedience, and their adaptability. Their training must prioritize the elimination of emotional ties with previous family structures. In Vietcong camps, miners were transferred in batches, registered with new names and assigned to companies according to aptitudes. Rotation rates were high. Those who survived one campaign were reassigned to another zone. They rarely remained more than 6 months in the same group. This constant mobility prevented the formation of lasting bonds and made difficult any attempt at solidarity or internal resistance. The names of miners were not officially registered. Their deaths did not appear in reports. Their remains, when recovered, were buried without identification. They did not appear in commemorative lists, did not receive honors, and their stories were lost among general casualty figures. They were replaceable, functional, temporary. The systematic use of miners by the Vietcong was not improvised or secondary. It formed an integral part of a strategy that conceived childhood not as a stage to protect, but as a resource to model, mobilize, and sacrifice. The objective was not only to add combatants, but to form an armed generation from the base, without a past to remember or future to expect outside the conflict. The landscape as weapon, environmental terror, and human shields. The Vietcong achieved a radical transformation of the Vietnamese environment, converting jungles, fields, and paths into a lethal ecosystem where each natural element was transformed into a potential source of sudden death. This strategy transcended military sabotage to become total psychological warfare that made walking a potentially deadly act. Poisoned spike traps represented the most widespread manifestation of this philosophy. Bamboo stakes cut at specific angles and hardened by fire were driven into pits disguised with natural vegetation. But their lethality was amplified through toxic substances, human excrement, putrid blood, plant poisons, and stolen chemicals that guaranteed deadly infections even in superficial wounds. The design did not seek instant death, but incapacitating wounds that would require costly evacuation and have maximum demoralizing effects. A soldier with a poisoned stake piercing his foot became a terror lesson that psychologically affected dozens of companions. They were strategically distributed in bottlenecks, proximities of water sources, and evacuation routes. Some were deliberately visible to create anxiety, others remained hidden to maintain unpredictable threat. American reports from 1968 established that 10% of casualties in certain units resulted from punji traps, not from enemy fire. Artisanal mines used recycled materials from unexploded bombs, creating a perverse cycle where enemy weaponry was converted into their own ammunition. They were camouflaged in cans, toys, agricultural tools, even animal corpses. The grenade in can secured a grenade without pin inside a container through wire connected to trip cable. When touched, it exploded at torso level, maximizing damage to vital organs. In Quang Tri, a Marine battalion lost 23 men in one day due to a chain of interconnected traps that extended 2 kilometers. This technique required advanced engineering knowledge and precise coordination that evidenced sophistication of the sabotage program. Unlike conventional warfare, the Vietcong prioritized permanent incapacitating wounds that would maximize human and logistical cost. A wounded soldier needed multiple companions for transport, evacuation helicopters, specialized surgeons, and months of treatment. Traps were designed to tear off extremities, mutilate genitals, perforate bellies without immediately damaging vital organs, causing permanent disability. Many included spring mechanisms that launched multiple projectiles against faces and eyes, causing blindness and disfigurement that would pursue survivors for decades. Soldiers developed collective paranoia, conscious that each step could mean facial mutilation or genital wounds that would destroy their reproductive lives. The Manual of Guerrilla Warfare, captured in 1967, contained instructions for 52 types of traps, classified according to terrain, tactical objective, type of desired wound, and available materials. It included sections on psychology of fear, homemade explosive engineering, and camouflage techniques that converted lethal traps into elements indistinguishable from the natural landscape. William B. Holden, wounded in 1969, described, "I felt the horrible crunch of bone fracturing against hardened bamboo. My tibia was pierced by a point that dripped dark substance that I later learned was excrement mixed with plant poison. There were no enemies shooting, only absolute silence. I understood that the jungle itself had become my enemy." Dr. Raymond A. Harris related a scene from 1970. "A soldier stepped on a mine hidden in an artificial melon. When we arrived, he no longer had a recognizable face, only torn flesh and eyes that cried blood. The first thing he articulated was begging us to kill him." In villages under total Vietcong control, civilians functioned as active components of the tactical arsenal. During confrontations, commanders systematically placed children, pregnant women, elderly and sick in front of defensive positions, creating human shields that prevented American or South Vietnamese troops from shooting without violating international rules. This tactic exploited the moral superiority of Western forces trained to minimize civilian casualties, contrasting with communist disposition to sacrifice entire populations for temporary military advantages. The guerrillas knew that American soldiers would hesitate before shooting where civilians were visible, providing crucial seconds of tactical advantage. In planned ambushes, the first to appear were unarmed peasants, pushed toward enemy lines while snipers waited hidden. American rules prohibited shooting at civilians, creating vulnerability windows that were exploited with lethal precision. A South Korean officer in Gwangnam documented how complete populations were chained and forced to walk in front of armored columns during movements that anticipated ambushes with anti-tank mines. Civilians who tried to escape were executed immediately as warning. The use as human explosive detectors represented an especially cruel practice. In areas with suspected mines, commandos forced groups of villagers, including families with children, to walk in line over dangerous paths. This technique detected enemy explosives without risking trained combatants, terrorized other populations, and provided safe routes for subsequent troops. Survivors were marked as potential informants if they revealed information and forced to repeat the function in new operations. This practice converted peasant families into human detectors, forcing them to clean minefields with their bodies to protect forces that had kidnapped them. Vietcong ambushes became theatrical representations of absolute terror. They were initiated with a distant explosion that served as a signal for simultaneous rain of shots from hidden positions prepared during weeks. Soldiers who sought refuge activated traps, pre-positioned in all logical cover sites, stakes under bushes, grenades with cables in fallen trees, disguised pits behind rocks. In seconds, an organized patrol was transformed into chaotic mass of wounded soldiers, screams of agony and absolute panic, while attackers remained invisible and immune to return fire. This disparity between capacity to cause damage and vulnerability to counterattack created sensation of helplessness that broke military morale more effectively than any conventional defeat. They generated lasting psychological effects: paranoid distrust among soldiers, pathological fear of moving through unknown terrain, and cohesion collapse that required weeks of therapy or complete rotation out of combat. Environmental terror demonstrated how a force inferior in conventional weaponry could neutralize technological advantages of modern armies through calculated cruelty, superior knowledge of terrain, and absolute disposition to sacrifice human lives for political objectives. This transformation of landscape into death ecosystem represented tactical innovation that influenced subsequent conflicts, where insurgent groups adopted similar methods: environmental terror, human shields, and conversion of civilian populations into disposable tactical instruments to confront superior military forces. The kidnapped memory, heroic myth versus buried truth. In reunified Vietnam after 1975, the Vietcong conquered not only military victory, but the infinitely more strategic territory of national historical memory. While its crimes have been exhaustively documented by witnesses, researchers, and international archives within Vietnam, the National Liberation Front remains consecrated as an immaculate symbol of heroic resistance. The Communist Party has constructed a hegemonic narrative that glorifies the Viet Cong as incarnation of peasant heroism and liberating force that rescued the country from imperialism. This mythology presents guerrillas as almost supernatural figures who fought with absolute moral purity, using only methods justified by anti-colonial nobility. In official museums of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, exhibitions exclusively highlight heroic aspects of the popular struggle, omitting any reference to methods for controlling, terrorizing, and murdering civilian populations. Dioramas show guerrillas rescuing villagers, distributing food, teaching to read, and defending communities. There is no mention of purges, child soldiers, torture camps, or problematic aspects of NLF actions. Educational books present the Viet Cong as integral component of the Patriotic Front without recognition of controversial methods. It is taught that all communist acts were necessary and morally superior, justified by national liberation. South Vietnamese victims are portrayed as imperialist collaborators or completely excluded. State control of media and internet censorship guarantee suppression of alternative narratives. Journalists who have investigated controversial aspects faced intimidation, license loss, and economic pressure that forced them to abandon investigations or emigrate. Academics who conducted critical research experienced project cancellation, archive permit denial, and dismissals justified by anti-state activity. The War Remnants Museum exemplifies this manipulation. It exhibits in detail American atrocities, My Lai, Napalm, Agent Orange, tortures in South Vietnamese prisons. However, it does not contain a single mention of Viet Cong victims, communist executions, child soldiers, torture camps, human shields, or criticisms of the NLF. This unilateral exhibition creates distorted narrative where only one side committed crimes while the other operated with moral purity. Educational texts omit critical analysis of the communist movement. Interviews with teachers reveal explicit instructions to avoid controversial discussions. When students pose uncomfortable questions, they are trained to respond that these are malicious rumors, imperialist propaganda, or lies from reactionary elements. Access to alternative information remains controlled through filtering that blocks searches about sensitive terms. Searches about Hue Massacre, Viet Cong crimes, child soldiers, Vietnam return filtered results that exclude critical sources. Social networks operate under supervision of algorithms that detect and eliminate subversive content. Users who share victim testimonies face warnings, suspensions, and police investigation. After victory, hundreds of thousands of civilians, officials, and military faced persecution designed to eliminate alternative institutional memory. 200,000 were sent to re-education camps, where they spent periods from months to decades under extreme deprivation and intensive indoctrination. These camps functioned as institutions of cultural destruction, where attempts were made to erase identity, memory, and previous loyalties. Others opted for maritime exile in the boat people, facing storms, piracy, hunger, and 50% mortality on some routes, preferring these risks before remaining under the regime. Those who remained were subjected to forced silence. Speaking of witnessed executions, suffered tortures or murdered family members could result in permanent surveillance, work exclusion, service denial, and confinement. Victim families learned to maintain memories in absolute silence, transmitting traumatic stories only in private whispers while publicly expressing enthusiastic support for the regime. This cultural schizophrenia created society where official memory and lived experience existed in disconnected, parallel universes. In exile, especially in communities of the United States, Australia, France, and Canada, memory was kept alive through alternative institutions: community museums, documentation centers, human rights organizations, and oral archives where survivors could relate experiences without reprisals. However, these voices remained isolated from Vietnamese society, creating division between memory preserved in diaspora and silence imposed internally. The comparison between treatment of My Lai and Hue reveals the selective nature of historical justice. My Lai has been subject of exhaustive investigations, documentaries, books, monuments, official American apologies, and teaching in military schools as example of criminal behavior. Officers were subjected to public trials, journalists won awards for exposing it, and it became a global symbol of American military excesses. In absolute contrast, Hue remains unknown outside academic circles and is denied by Vietnam. No official monuments exist, investigations have been prohibited, there are no institutional apologies, families have been silenced, and the subject is excluded from public education. This disparity illustrates how control of historical narratives depends on contemporary political power more than factual evidence or moral gravity. The United States, as a democracy with independent media, could not suppress My Lai indefinitely. Vietnam, as an authoritarian state with total control of media and institutions, has maintained almost absolute silence about Hue for 5 decades. Archives declassified since the 90s by CIA, State Department, and international organizations have provided extensive documentation about the Vietcong's repressive apparatus, reports on purges, blacklists, secret camps, torture methods, and forced recruitment. Interviews with repentant ex-combatants have also emerged, such as the one published by Asia Times in 2007, where an ex-commander confessed, "We were trained to eliminate without hesitation. The people were enemy if they didn't follow us unconditionally. Today, no one wants to remember what we really did." However, this documentation does not circulate in Vietnam, and distributing it is classified as subversive activity, penalized with up to 20 years in prison under national security laws. In cities like Westminster, Melbourne, Paris, and Montreal, the diaspora has constructed alternative memorial infrastructure. Commemorative altars, cultural centers, and historical archives dedicated to preserving memory of the forgotten. Organizations like Boat People SOS, Vietnamese American Heritage Foundation, and South Vietnamese Historical Society work to recover documents, record testimonies of aging survivors, and teach censored history to new generations. The memory of Hue, child soldiers, clandestine prisons, and exterminated families remains alive only in these marginal spaces, waiting for the historical moment to reclaim its place in the Vietnamese national narrative. The silence that envelops Vietcong crimes is not accident, but deliberate project of the Vietnamese state to erase uncomfortable history and construct nationalist myth that does not resist factual scrutiny. This project has achieved extraordinary success within Vietnam, where generations grew up ignorant of fundamental aspects of their national history. However, historical truth possesses persistence that transcends temporary political power. Authentic memory survives in whispers of elderly who witnessed events, archives of international organizations, testimonies preserved in democracies, and voices of exile that refuse to allow truth to disappear under state propaganda. The Viet Cong was not exclusively an army of heroic peasants fighting for independence. It was simultaneously a sophisticated apparatus of ideological repression, indoctrination, political terror, and physical elimination of elements that could obstruct construction of the totalitarian state that Vietnam became after 1975. If the complete history must be told with intellectual honesty and respect for all victims, it must include this dark side that governments, academics, media, and international organizations still refuse to examine with the intensity dedicated to Western crimes of the same period. Only when both sides receive equivalent recognition, When all victims are honored regardless of political affiliation, and when complete truth triumphs over ideological convenience, will Vietnam be able to reconcile with its past and construct a future based on justice, memory, and universal human dignity?